Hello everyone. Today in this session we are discussing 6th semester BA optional English paper 7 Literatures of India and Introduction. The topic that we are discussing today is Indian English poetry. The first phase of Indian English poetry was the period of literary renaissance in India. Derozio's poems, Kasi Prasad Ghosh, The Share or Minstrel and Other Poems, Michael Madhusudan Dutt's The Captive Lady, Manmohan Ghosh, The Love Songs, and Elegies are a testimony to the creative upsurge occasioned by the romantic spirit kindled by the literary renaissance. Toru Dutt alone, among these romantic poets of the first phase, puts an emphasis on India and her heritage by putting into verse a large number of Indian legends. The romantic Toru Dutt is also precedes in respect to the use of tree in verse as demonstrated by our Casuarina tree. Precedes in respect of childhood memories recalled with nostalgia or regret. The poets of the second phase, still romantic in spirit, were Sarojini Naidu, Tagore, Aurobindo Ghosh, and Harindranath Chattopadhyaya. The poetic output of these poets was prolific. The romanticism of these Indian poets was fraught with nationalism, spirituality, and mysticism. It was therefore different from Indian English Romanticism. Indian Romanticism widened the poet's vision, while Aurobindo's was the search for the divine in man, and Tagore's was the quest for the beautiful in man and nature. Both were philosopher poets. Sarojini Naidu's romantic muse underscored the charm and splendor of traditional Indian life and Indian scene. She had a fine ear for verbal melody as she was influenced not only by English poetry but also by the Persian and Urdu poetry. She excelled in lyricism. Poetry written in the colonial period with a view to establish Indian identity by the Indian poets was an explosion or rather outburst of emotions. The nationalistic, philosophical, spiritual, or mystical emotions. The appeal was to the heart of the readers. The poetry of Toru Dutt, Sri Aurobindo, Tagore, and Sarojini Naidu could not be romantic since they had to express the ethos of the age. They were not merely imitating the English romantics, Victorians, and decadents blindly. Their poetry was the best voice of the contemporary Indian time spirit. It would be fair to say that Toru Dutt and Sarojini Naidu constitute a kind of watershed between the first two phases, in that they share their preceders' individual nostalgia as well as their successors' sense of crisis and quest for identity. The post independence poetry, the ethos of the post independence phase of Indian English literature, is radically different from the first two phases. Its relation to the first two phases is that of the modern age. In English literature, to Victorianism, when the question of political independence was resolved in 1947 with the partition of India. The tension of the Indian psyche suddenly relaxed. The post independence era of hope and aspiration was replaced by an era of questioning and ironic exposure. The national identity achieved after independence gave Indian writers a new confidence to be the critic of the present, the past of themselves. In this new spirit and confidence, the Indian poets found themselves in the modern English and American poets. So, once again, there was borrowing up to some extent, as in the first two phases of Indian poetry, while the pre 1947 poets borrowed from the Romantics, Victorians, and New Romantics of the decadent period. The post 1947 poets borrowed from the modernist poets like Yeats, Eliot, Pound, and Auden. So there are some of the factors that are responsible for the emergence of new or modernist, or we can call it as an experimental in English poetry, Indian English poetry. The factors are, the first one is the economic progress achieved through the government's policies of democratic socialism and 5-year plans. The social progress achieved though the rise in mass education, the economic and social progress resulted in the broadening of the middle class sections of the society. The spread of the English language and the evolution of English culture alongside Hindi and the regional languages hasten the process of modernization. English has been Indianized in pronunciation, intonation, stress part, idiom, word, order, and the syntax. The next factor is the scientific and technological advancement, the scientific temperament, and the modern sensibility has given rise to agnosticism and atheism among the educated intellectuals. The modern educated intellectual Indians is critical of the formal and ritualistic religion. The modern sensibility has led to an open mode of expression in social relationship. That is also one of the factors. And modern poetry deals in concrete terms with the concrete experiences in free verse. The rhyme and other devices of meter and stanzaic forms are discarded. The major poet, the major post-independence Indian English poets are Nizam Ezekiel, Dom Morris, P. Lal, Adil Jasuwala, A.K. Ramanujan, R. Parthsarthi, Giv Patel, Arvind Mehrotra, Pritish Nandi, Kamala Das, K.N. Daruwala, Shivakumar, Jayant Mahapatra, Dilip Chithre, Salim Pridina, Santan Rodney's, Yunes D'Souza, Silgado, Meena Alexander, Agha Shashid Ali, Vikram Seth, Manohar Shetty, and many more. The post-independence poetry underwent with a concrete expressions in free verse. Rhyme and other devices are of meter and stanzaic forms are discarded. The major post-independence Indian English poets are, as I said, Nizam Ezekiel, Ramanujan, Parthasarathi, all that. The post-independence poetry, they underwent a sea change as far as the themes are concerned. The poets are faced with the crisis of identity. To their poetry is one of quest, a search for the self, a search for their cultural roots. The reason for such a theme of Indian poetry is not for to seek. The Indian poets who express themselves in English have their cultural roots in their community.
The reason for such a theme of Indian poetry is not for to seek. The Indian poets who express themselves in English have their cultural roots in their community. Many of these Indian poets have been educated abroad, but since they belong to the middle class, they find themselves alienated with their own immediate circle and even from the westernized ethos. Some of the poets came from different racial backgrounds, but are nationals of India, for example. Nizam Ezekiel is a Jew, Dom Montz is an Anglo Indian, Keki Daruwala and Jasuwala are Parsis, and Eunice D'Souza is a Goan Christian. The Indian poet writing in English, therefore, finds himself alienated. So, the poetry of modern Indian poets naturally turns on the theme of identity crisis. Poets like Ramanujan, Parthasarathi, and Arun Kolka are preoccupied with the problems of the roots. Their examination of Hindu ethos has been in several directions. Ramanujan, for example, conjures up his early childhood memories with strong sense impressions. At the same time, his mind keeps examining the strong and weak points of his cultural heritage. Parthasarathi, too, he's obsessed with his roots in India while leading a westernized lifestyle. For example, his poem Rough Passage is an attempt to deal with the theme of identity exposed to two cultures, namely Indian and the Western. The scrutiny of society is another subject matter of the modern Indian poetry. The poets who write in English were born, say, in the 20s and the 30s of this century. And on growing up, they have been a part of independent India. They are a witness to and a part of socio-economic and political changes that they cannot but be critical of all that happens around them. So, the socio political and economic scene, as it impinges on the poet's consciousness, becomes the subject matter of modern poetry. Arun Kulatkar's Jejuri is an example in that point. A mood of disillusionment and despair, cynicism and sarcasm characterizes modern Indian poetry. uh, Alienation and exile, the crisis of personal identity and cultural identity, childhood memories, familial relations, and love, nostalgia for the past and cultural traditions, therefore, constitute the themes of Indian poets. In the case of some poets, the sense of alienation from the family or the community becomes so overwhelming that they turn completely inward. The result of such inwardness is highly personal poetry, confessional in tone, and obsessed with loneliness and insecurity, from which they escape is sought either in erotic fantasies or the self probing of a tortured soul. Such is the poetry of, you can say, Kamala Das and Shiv Kumar, many other like that. The next phase is the post colonial era, where it is largely represented, marked by the emergence of voices from the marginalized group. You can say this includes women writers, poets from the lower caste class, particularly Dalits, and poets from the smaller non metropolitan centers. As a heterogeneous group of writers, they challenge the traditional upper caste, male literary establishment and force us to question our assumption about Indianness and Indian literature. So, converging unexpectedly in the 1970s and 80s, the women poets and the subaltern poets have broadened and they have challenged the social world of the contemporary poetry to an extent that we still cannot assess or foresee. So, to sum up the context of modern Indian poetry, you can say that the first half of the 20th century is the first phase, where the various languages they collectively went through a phase of nationalist writing, where the movement includes thousands of popular poets who wrote poems about Mother India. And during this nationalist movement, Indian poetry as a whole, we can say that it seemed to be at one with its social and political environment. Uh, in the subsequent movements, this identification gave way to a sense of alienation between the poet and his milieu. And the second phase between 1920 to 1935, as we call it as a phase of romantic writing, where the poets attempted to replicate what the English romantics had done. uh, the primacy of the unique human individual and of intense personal experiences, the use of the lyrical mood produced by a body of private poetry, contrasting with the public rhetoric of nationalist poetry. And the next phase, which is progressive writers movement, launched in 1936 and was continued till 80s, which emphasized the significance of the Marxist thought and socialist and communist ideas. Many of the progressive writers characterized their rejected the patriotism and romanticism of their preceders, and they have attempted to paint a bleak and even anti-nationalist portrait of Indian society. So the next phase was started in the 1930s and continued to affect the writers till the end of the 70s, was the Indian counterpart of Anglo-American modernism, in which poets in almost every language broke away from traditional styles, techniques, and the themes. They dealt with the characteristic modernist themes like alienation, the individual in urban society, the pain of unresolved doubts, and a sense of disillusionment. The irony became a prevailing mode in this phase. The next was, as we have discussed, the post colonial era, which we largely represents, we read in the present semester, that has been marked by the emergence of voices from the marginalized groups, Dalits, and the poets from the smaller metropolitan centers. So these are all This is how that the Indian English poetry progressed through the years. So in the next section, we are discussing about one of the famous poet's poem, Poet, Lover, and Bird Watcher. So before that, we discussed Nazim Ezekiel and his literary career.